Benvenuti a tutti. Noi riprendiamo la sessione dopo il pomeriggio.
We open this afternoon session. It's quite hot outside. We have three presentations: social mobility, economic growth, inequality, social inequalities. We're going to have these three presentations. We will take a break, and then the Q&A session will follow. Well, to start off, we have the presentation of Wouter Ronsijn, Wouter Ryckbosch.
In inglese. In inglese.
Says, speaking about
Che devo fare?
at the end of the Middle Ages from the Low Countries.
Good afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon. First of all, I want to say thank you to the people who are organizing this conference for the opportunity to present our research. And I also would like to start by mentioning that this research, this paper is also based on data collected as part of the SMITE project led by Guido Alfani. Now, for this paper, we will be looking at income and wealth mobility in the Low Countries between 1400 and 1800, and particularly we will be looking at mobility in the towns, the smaller towns of the counties of Flanders and Holland. Now, since the late Middle Ages, the Low Countries, together with northern Italy, were part of the most densely urbanized regions of Europe, and based on previous research, we know that inequality in these towns was rising since the late Middle Ages. However, for a proper understanding of the experience of inequality, we also need to look at mobility. And the inequality estimates that we have are always based on cross-sections, snapshots of a certain moment in time. But the question is, how enduring was that inequality at the individual level? Did the rich always stay rich? Did the poor always stay poor? And do we see any trends in mobility levels between the late medieval period and the early modern period? So these are the questions that we try to address in this paper. How do we do this? Well, our method is quite similar to the method already presented earlier. So we do this by tracking the same people in successive tax lists. Here is the example of a certain person named Joris Blomme or George Blomme in the town of Loo, who in 1702 paid £12 in tax. In 1717 he paid £18 in tax, and in 1728 he paid £22 in tax. So each successive tax list, he's paying more taxes, while the average tax paid by all the citizens remained the same at £12. So we might conclude that he is experiencing upward mobility. And we also see, for example, that in 1728 he is addressed as Sir Joris Blomme. So this seems to be an example of upward mobility, but how common was this experience in the early modern period? So we do this by working with pairs of tax lists. So the tax lists that we link, each pair has a beginning year and an end year, and we look only at the people we find in both these tax lists. So we link these people, we determine their quintile position, and then we make a mobility estimate, which is the proportion of people ending up at a different quintile than the one in which they started. This is a simplified example from St. Nicholas in Flanders, using two tax lists from 1675 and 1692. There are 152 people we can follow between these 2 years. The ones in the diagonal line between the green and red bars, they're the ones who stay immobile, who don't change their quintile position. The ones in green are the ones who are moving up, and the ones in red are the ones who are moving down. And together that is 43% of the group that we can follow. So our mobility estimate here would be 43%. Now, to apply this approach, we need quite good sources. This approach is quite demanding with regards to sources. We need tax lists that are informative of people's fiscal capacities, that have individual data, and that are close enough in time to be able to follow the same people. And there are many cases where we can do that for very long consecutive periods of time. But here we will present data for 6 towns in the Low Countries, 4 towns in the county of Flanders, Dixmude, Hoeke, Loo and Sint-Niklaas, and 2 towns in the county of Holland in the north, Brielle and Schiedam. This is the graph showing the years of our tax list. So each dot on this graph represents a tax list that we can use. And as you can see, not all of our cases cover the entire period because we have to work with what there is. We have a few, 2 medieval cases, late medieval cases, Dixmude and Hoeke, both in Flanders. But most of the data we have is from the early modern period. We have some information from Brielle for the 16th and 17th century. We can track Schiedam for a quite long period of time, from the middle of the 16th until the end of the 18th century. And then we have data for Loo and for Sint-Niklaas from the late 17th century until the end of the 18th century. And based on these taxes, we can make mobility estimates, and altogether this allows us to make 39 mobility estimates. But underlying these estimates, there are almost 37,000 individual records. Because we have to work with the sources that were drawn up in the past and that have been preserved until today, we cannot be very picky about the time intervals between tax lists. So the time intervals between the beginning year and end year, they vary. We set a maximum of 20 years, but most of our pairs of tax lists have between 5 and 15, some up to 20 years in between. That means that the mobility estimates that we that we show represent more or less medium-term or long-term individual mobility. So short-term mobility shocks are averaged out in our estimates. Now, the fact that these time intervals differ between pairs of tax lists influences our results. First of all, it influences the percentage of people that we can link between the beginning tax list and the end of the tax list. If there are only a few years in between these taxes, we can link up to 60–70% of all the people. But if there are 10 or 15 years between tax lists, this drops to about 40%. Also, it influences our mobility estimates. The more time, this is shown on this graph, the more time there is between the beginning year and the end year, the more likely we are to find people ending up in a different quintile than the one in which they started. And this is something we need to take into account. This can create a bias if you want to compare different periods and different locations. So we need to normalize this somehow, and the way I did this is a normalized result. I try to normalize all these estimates to 10-year intervals, and the normalized result is the expected result for a 10-year interval multiplied by the ratio between the observed and the expected result for the given time interval. And how do we get the expected result? The expected result is estimated by a very basic regression analysis using only 2 predictors, namely the time interval and location dummies. What this basically means is that we assume that the slope, here we assume that the slope is the same for each location, but that only the intercept differs by location. And then these are the normalized results. You can see there is still a lot of variance going on, but it is no longer a function of the time interval between the tax lists. If we put these results on a graph showing trends in time, it looks like this. A first thing that we need to point out is that the estimates for Schiedam are considerably lower than all other estimates. And this is to do with the nature, probably it has to do with the nature of the sources. So the taxes of Schiedam, they tax the owners of real estate, mostly the owners of the houses, based on the rental value of the houses. But they do not re-estimate the rental values of the houses for each tax list. They estimate them once and then they use these estimates for very long periods of time. For example, there was an estimate in the 1630s that was used for a century until the 1730s. And that's, for example, why you get in Schiedam this spike in the 1730s with apparently very high mobility, but that's just because the rental values were re-estimated in that year. So what this means is that our estimates for Schiedam are more a proxy of wealth mobility, because they show mobility based on the ownership of real estate, whereas the other tax lists are more indicative of income mobility. Another point that we might that might appear from these results is that there perhaps could be a downward trend in mobility levels between the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. And so you can see that our estimates for the late medieval period are somewhat higher than those for the early modern period, but there is still a lot of variance. And I would cautiously conclude that we do not have enough evidence to say that really there is a downward trend in mobility levels. But as you can see, there is still individual case mobility in individual locations does fluctuate. For example, in the town of Schiedam, if we ignore the spike that we see in the 1730s, it would seem that there is an upward trend in mobility levels in the course of the 18th century. Now, what was happening in Schiedam in the 18th century, the population of the town was gradually growing, and it was also becoming the largest gin producer of Holland. And Schiedam was a town counting the highest number of distilleries in Holland. So does that mean we can conclude that rising mobility levels are associated with some population growth, with industrialization? Well, it's not clear, because if we look at the case of St. Nicholas, in the course of the 18th century, we see rather declining mobility levels. But St. Nicholas was also growing demographically very rapidly, or quite rapidly, in the 18th century, and it was also a town undergoing industrialization in textile production. So, in a sense, these are, in some respects, these are similar towns, but the mobility trends in these two towns are going in the opposite direction. Maybe it's because St. Nicholas rather represents income mobility, and Schiedam rather represents wealth mobility. Also, something notable is that the mobility levels in Low Town between the late 17th and early 18th century show a very outspoken U curve. Now, the low point in mobility levels at the end of the 17th century in Low Town corresponds with a short period of peace between the 9 Years' War on the one hand and the War of the Spanish Succession on the other hand. So does it mean that periods of warfare are associated with high levels of mobility and periods of peace are associated with low levels of mobility? Well, we can't really conclude that, because in the same town, at the end of the 18th century, we can see very similar levels of mobility between the rather peaceful 1780s and the period of the French Revolutionary War in the 1790s. And here warfare doesn't seem to have an effect on mobility levels. And also in the other cases, we do not really see a pattern emerging between periods of warfare and periods of peace. So overall, there doesn't seem to be an overall common trend in mobility levels. Rather, what we see is that mobility levels fluctuated in each of these locations based on particular local circumstances. But we do not have enough evidence to conclude that there is an overall common trend, or that there is a general pattern emerging yet from these data. Now, what I've shown you so far is total mobility. Any move from any quintile into any other quintile. But one of the questions that we asked in the beginning is that Did the rich always stay rich, and did the poor always stay poor? So in these final graphs, I'll be looking at the top and the bottom quintiles. And these are quintiles that can only move in one direction. People at the top can, if they move, they can only move down, and people at the bottom, they can only move upwards. And we can see that, yes, indeed, there is some fluidity in these pre-modern societies, as some people manage to either fall down from the top or climb up from the bottom, but it is rather a minority of people. The majority of people in the top or bottom quintiles stay in their quintile. So it's only a minority that in these groups that experience mobility. And also based on these box plots, it seems that the rich are better at staying rich, whereas the poor tend to have a bit more mobility. Now this is people from the top and the bottom who move at least one quintile. If we split this up further, and this is on the one hand the part of the data here shown here the same as in the previous graph, the people moving at least one quintile. But if we look at the people moving at least two quintiles, that is people who are moving to the middle of the distribution. If you move from the bottom quintile, and you move 2 quintiles, you end up in the 3rd quintile, the middle of the distribution, and the same for the people at the top. You see that mobility levels, if you move 2 quintiles, are even lower. And only about 20% of the people manage to move 2 quintiles. So that is not much. 80% of the people do not stay in their half of the distribution. So, to conclude, in this paper we try to reconstruct mobility levels in the smaller towns of the Low Countries. We did so by tracking people along successive tax lists. And cautiously we prefer to conclude that we do not have enough evidence to say that there really is a downward trend in mobility levels. The data seem to suggest there is one, but there is also a lot of fluctuation going on in the individual towns. But we also seem to find that pre-industrial societies were fairly rigid. As some people did experience mobility, it was always a minority. People at the top and at the bottom tended to stay in their half of the distribution. Thank you.
Grazie per questa relazione di Paesi Bassi.
Thank you, this general presentation. And now we switch right to Luxembourg with the presentation of Sonia Schifano, who's going to speak about inequality in pre-industrial Luxembourg, comparing the effects of the end of feudalism in rural and urban areas. The microphone, please. Switch it on, please. Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the chance to present this work, which belongs to my doctoral research program. Master research program. These work in cooperation with Ferreira and Paccoud, and this is one of showing results about wealth inequalities in Luxembourg from 1662 up to 1842, comparing the effects of the end of feudalism in rural and urban areas. So before proceeding with the analysis and the presentation of data, I just wanted to make the point of the socio-economic context, the background of the Luxembourg region. In 1766, Luxembourg was ruled by the Habsburgs of Austria, and the reigning queen was Maria Theresa of Austria. As an approach, institutional approach, Maria Theresa tried to introduce some reforms, trying to decrease the levels of inequalities. Another of these reforms was the introduction of the Theresian cadastre, but also this was about a new policy to improve, to upgrade the educational system and health system of the Kingdom. of her kingdom. In 1795, in Luxembourg, we had a revolutionary regime. This regime took control. With this revolutionary regime in 1804. We got the Napoleon Civic Code, which is a breakthrough vis-à-vis 1766, and the Teresa Cadastre in 1766 was still ruled by the Habsburgs, agricultural country, focused on feudalism ties. In 1804, the introduction of the Napoleon Civic Code. The system is still focusing on this. This introduced private property, the abolishment of feudalism. In 1815, with the Vienna of Congress, Luxembourg was split into two parts under the control of the Netherlands. And in 1839, we have the territorial breakdown, division of Luxembourg into two parts. One part of the region still in Belgium today, and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg with the borders we know today. This map is just used to show the position of case studies. Luxembourg City, the city of Luxembourg, is in the middle, southbound. Bellage is a small community on the border with France. For the Teresa Cadastre of 1766, this idea, beyond the one of gathering or collecting more taxes, more tax collection to increase, the money in the treasury. The deal was to levy tax on Luxembourg, the clergy and the clergy, or the brotherhoods, confraternities, or lay association. And with this cadastre, we do see the distribution of wealth through properties, to the tax declaration, movable and immovable, assets, landed properties for the entire population shares, also including the rich. In the past, for some sources of some parts of Europe, Italy, the southern part of it, very often nobles were excluded from this kind of declaration. They are not to submit the tax declaration, the revenue tax declaration. So the city of Luxembourg was, one single city of Luxembourg, totally detached from the types of feudal institutions. We do this also in the professions of the taxpayers of the Teresa Cadastre. Most of the economy was around the secondary sector. So most of taxpayers had such an occupation for the manufacturing of services and goods. In Bellage, agricultural city, a feudal seigneury with two lords. 90% of the taxpayers had an activity which was pretty well agricultural, this activity. For the Teresa Cadastre, so, this is one law. The law, so thanks to which we introduced the Teresa Cadastre of 1766. You can just read this well out. This cadastre was just addressing anyone, also including the pretty nobility, lay institutes, religious institutes. No one excluded, not just the landowners of landed properties, but also the users and those who were renting these properties. So why should we make use of this Teresa cadastre? Why? So this cadastre is a very useful tool to use. For Luxembourg, it's of paramount importance, like it is the case in Milan. This cadastre is made by tables sent by the central government to Luxembourg. These tables were made available in French and in German as well. And the priority, the data reporting the cadastre, are not made in the modern way. Through some cost estimate by financial officers, but these were self-declaration or self-reporting documents, also raising doubts on the fake or true documents. And now we have two major bullet points to the table. First, there was just a very stringent control by the peers, by the other members of the community, Through this control, so all fake declarations were reported to the authorities, receiving that 50% of the rent of the portion of undeclared land over 10 years. The other 50% would be directly given to the state, to the government. Despite this all, through this orographic research, we know that the parts of land, acres declare reported. So this part is missing in this declaration, but historians do agree on this point, that the missing part was just for fake declarations submitted by the richest people of the community. For the monetary union, we used different currencies in Luxembourg. And also in the lounge in Luxembourg, we have dinners and also Florence, and we have dinners and Sol in the other village. So everything has been converted in order to have some estimates being easy to compare. Well, what strikes me, the Teresa cadastre has to be conceived in the sense of a municipal cadastre. So the taxpayers had to fill in this declaration in the municipality where they own the properties, the lands, or the real estate possessions. Also among these these taxpayers, we have the same people, just the case of one of the feudal lords of Dudelange, who is also one taxpayer of Luxembourg City. Well, to give you an idea how this cadastre worked those times, so this is a flow chart. This was sent by the central government to the taxpayers. At the very beginning, we have the personal information, name, surname, profession, job of the taxpayer, and also place of residence. Also, we have a first category of assets declared, reported. Be several types of lands. Among these types of lands, also we have the cultivated, not cultivated land, gardens, green gardens, orchards, vineyards. And in these two columns on the left-hand side, you have the value of the gross, yield, calculated by a coefficient, changed according to the type of land it reported. This was constant for type of land, and inside the same city, municipality, or commune, this was multiplied by surface of land rented or possessed. On the right-hand side, you have the net value, 4% of the gross value. That's a linear transformation, either use or the one. This does not change the matter. So also we have the declaration, the reporting of houses, real estate properties. In this specific case, we have no value reported for one house or dwelling. And what strikes me, for the Teresa cadastre, we have the feudal taxes. Feudal taxes of the feud were summed up either to the sum of the two categories, value or subtracted. So they were subtracted when ultimately the person in question was a user, using the portion of the land or the building, whereas this was summed up when the taxpayer was the owner, received the feudal taxes by the users of these properties of assets. And finally, at the end of the story, we have the total, paid value. I didn't consider this value as an income, but as a wealth, because this was the value reported by the taxpayer, not connected with the real rent, but with the potential rent. So it doesn't matter if the land was cultivated or not. The value was always calculated to the use of this multiplier and the surface of lands. For the Teresa cadastre 1766 for Luxembourg City, we have 1,100 declaration, 260 for the other city. 90% of the taxpayers reside in Luxembourg, and just 10% is women, more or less. So among women, not only we have widows, but also we have married women. The habit in Luxembourg, the common habit, except by the richest, was given part of the inheritance also to women, in addition to dowry, to protect them from the risk of marriage. We have the brooms and also the brides. The two spouses. That's the histogram of the distribution of wealth for Luxembourg City and for the Delange. I didn't use a logarithmic transformation, but rather this kind of transformation, because for the Delange we have a full set of declaration set up, so 0. So these were just set up artificially when the feudal taxes were higher than the estimated rent of the land use or the buildings use so far. If we take a look at du Delange, see if we look at the first levels of inequalities to the Lorentz curves, we do see plotting these two Lorentz curves, du Delange seems to be more dissimilar, because the distance vis-à-vis the equality line is longer vis-à-vis Luxembourg City. And so when we speak play and when we consider the distribution of wealth by deciles and the percentage of wealth possessed by the top 5 or top 1%, we still notice it's quite surprising to see the top 10%. The difference between possessed wealth by top 10% in Luxembourg City, it was almost 33%. This percentage goes to 74% when we say du Delange.
Questo invece è il registro Land Registry del 1842.
This is the Land Registry of 1842. This time the tax registries were
nel tempo e quindi venivano riportati.
Were drawn up not on a constant way over time, and you see a first snapshot of the assets possessed, wealth possessed. We're in the post-revolution period, so the taxpayers being the full owners of the assets or real estate properties. Between a register and the other were also variation of lands sold out or bought. So it was very important to see the first value in order to take into consideration afterwards the wealth distribution in 1842. From these histograms, we see that in 1842 the two distributions are very similar. They are very well distributed. In spite of all this, the Luxembourg City is richer than du Delange. And when we see the Lorentz curves, there is a reduction of the distance between these two curves between 1766 and 1842. So we can just expect some convergence of the inequality levels in 1842 between these two places observed. So for the distribution of wealth distribution by the side top 5 and top 1, we do see that in this case, the distance of the wealth possessed in incident from top 10% and du Delange Luxembourg City shrinks from 32% of possessed wealth in 1766 down to 42% in 1842. But this shrinks, it shrinks the percentage of wealth possessed between 1766 and 1842 for the rural center of du Delange. So we asked, are we considering the entire population resident living in these two locations, in these places? And so we realized immediately, first and foremost, we didn't get all those zeros for the declaration of 1766 in Luxembourg City. So if we try to understand then, so the amount of the population resident in Luxembourg City in 1766, doing so we realize that some remarks were missing. So using a multiplying coefficient between 3 and 4, so according to the real average number of children for the households in the Delange in 1766, we should have added on almost the double of people not having nothing. So So we were not considering the entire distribution, real distribution for the Luxembourg city. This was not the case instead for Dieu de l'Ange. So the idea is that Dieu de l'Ange was still a community, very agricultural, in order to provide people to make use or to possess a small plot of land, to plow these lands, to cultivate also for subsistence. For Luxembourg City instead, many people had occupations in the field of trade, and probably this is not laid down in the declarations because these people didn't get any relationship, any rent contract with the owners, but they were just shop workers, They were just housed in the back of the shop or in the buildings owned by the owner of the shop, the workshop. But what we noticed is that also the density, demographic density, the households in Luxembourg City were more. We have cases looking at the census of 1842. We have cases under the same roof. We can see more or less 20 people under the same roof, in the same house. Most people not included in the missing tax declarations can also be explained this way.
Abbiamo quindi replicato un'analisi di diseguaglianza basata
Now we see the inequalities according to distribution, which has been extrapolated by the Teresa Cadastre and by the Land Registry of 1842.
Gini è sempre inferiore per Lussemburgo città.
Gini coefficient is always lower for the Luxembourg city before the introduction of the Napoleon Code. This is not true when we extend the distribution, also including those having nothing.
Il Lussemburgo città. E quindi se al 1766
1766 Gini coefficient is lower for Luxembourg city, in 1842 this is not the case. And above all, what you see, Luxembourg City becomes unequal vis-à-vis Dieu de l'Ange. We have several interpretations for this. For one side, we can also consider also the contest, the socio-economic contest of Luxembourg City vis-à-vis Dieu de l'Ange, what already said in the past days, vis-à-vis the migratory flows. Also simply looking at the tax declarations, the reports we have. So we're not observing one part of the population migrating, some coming in or living in the country, fleeing the country. But for 1842, so ultimately, so for Luxembourg City, using the real distribution, wealth distribution, which has been calculated, we have a higher inequality rate, because ultimately, since this is a country totally disconnected from feudal links, at the time of 1760, the owners of the landed properties had more time to accrue money or resources and to have a more socioeconomic condition or status more stable. For social mobility, here we go. This time, the idea was the one of, so we tried just to connect all together the registry of 1766 with the ones of 1842 to just a direct linking from fathers to sons. For 1760, we started from the taxpayer of 1766. For Dieu de l'Ange, we started from taxpayers of all 1766, and we gather also the descendants of these taxpayers for over 5 generations. We collected more or less 15,000 observations, just to link more or less to at least 100 or 220 people. For Luxembourg City, we did the other way around. So we started from the taxpayers 1842, and to a site for Luxembourg, we reconstructed the genealogical tree of taxpayers, and then we go back to the ancestors still living in 1766. The first thing I want to share for the study of social mobility is the percentage of remarks, observation. We were good in listing between 1760 and 1842. The percentage of taxpayers listed for Dieu de l'Ange is more or less 50%, where this shrinks down to 15% for Luxembourg City. And so once again, the migratory events can also be a possible explanation of this, in addition to the point that in Luxembourg City, this was the capital city of this country, so most of the nobility live there. Most nobles live in Luxembourg City. No reason to sell real estate properties, because the declarations for Luxembourg City, the main item is just buildings, not landed properties. This was not the case of Dudelange. We also presented the social mobility rates with some regression analysis to see the correlation between wealth of the ancestors and descendants. This time, the rank shows the position of the taxpayer, also considering the final sample, also considering the taxpayers we were capable of listing, and then we also considered having or not having 50 years of age, and some additional information for the ancestors. For the ancestors, so we considered the average value of wealth possessed by all the ancestors we had at fingertips. What I forgot to say in listing, between 1766 and 1842, we followed the ancestors from the mother and from the father. So for each taxpayer of 1842 to consider the generational distance is more than one. We can have more than one ancestors in 1766, and so we weighted all this by generational distance between the taxpayer 1842 and the ancestor 1766, and then we made the average of the wealth of all the ancestors.
Possiamo vedere da questa correlazione
From this correlation, we can see that we have a strong positive and meaningful correlation of the wealth reported by the ancestors vis-à-vis the wealth possessed by the taxpayers in 1842, and social mobility seems to be lower in Luxembourg City vis-à-vis Dudelange. This result has been reproduced
utilizzando le tavole di mobilità sociale.
This has been confirmed using the social mobility tables. 63%.
Considerando sia la mobilità in alto sia la
total mobility is different.
del 66.8%.
For Dudelange, 68.8%. To finish this off, what we have seen that ultimately we observing just the Gini index with the regional distribution taken from the Theresa cadastre from the register 1842, Luxembourg City seems to be constantly equal to Dudelange. The urban center seems to be more or less the same. The result, which is also not confirmed when we include those not having nothing, also considering the point that the abolishment of feudal system seems to have a major effect in the rural area vis-à-vis the urban area. Well, for social mobility instead, these changes and these fluctuations for inequalities, they do not translate into a real increase of social mobility. In fact, in the two case studies, social mobility is more or less similar and also linear. Thank you.
Allora noi passiamo all'Inghilterra con una relazione di Niels Cummins sobre disuguaglianza economica e mobilità sociale intergenerazionale.
So, hello, can I verify the acoustics are okay and translations okay? Great, okay, look, it's really a great honor to be here. Thank you so much for including me and also the rest of the LSE community in this wonderful event. So, for better or worse, there's a lot going on in this paper. So what I'm going to try and communicate to you is maybe the executive summary, okay? So I prepared a lot of slides, far too many, so I'm going to skip through them, and I apologize for that now. There might be more apologies coming forward. It represents a preview or an overview of a new project, and the project is going to basically hoover up millions of last will and testaments in England and analyze them, using the tools of big data, but basically look at questions from a very kind of interdisciplinary perspective. And so it's just a very exciting moment to be kind of launching into this. And so today's talk is going to be a kind of schema for how you could use such documents to estimate wealth inequality and also social mobility over time. So I think the results are, really surprisingly, clear, given the fact that this will be tweaked going forward. But this is a very early stage, and your comments are very welcome. So I'm going to skip through this, but this came up yesterday, but the first day, someone was asking, God, why on earth are we doing any of this? Why does it matter? So my kind of motivation for this is that if you look at like contemporary discourse in basically the acceptability of the capitalist world in which we live in, it basically boils down to your interpretation of the history of inequality over the past few centuries, perhaps millennium, and in particular what the events of modern growth and industrial revolution did for inequality. So this is actually a space in which has long been discussed, but I mean, the recent wave of attention is clearly, ignited in a public way by Piketty in 2014, but has been recently, added to by, in particular Guido Alfani, who I'll mention a few times throughout this, with the recent book As Gods Among Men. So this is really something that, is something that we all care about. But there are surprisingly many empirical gaps, and also, I would say, conceptual kind of issues, and I'd like to kind of talk about them during my talk. And so what the kind of source that we exploit here are these documents, last will and testaments, and typically in about 1,000 of the dying person's last words, they detailed the direction of assets at death. They surprisingly, particularly the further you go back, they surprisingly have a lot of detailed personal information on how people felt about their close relatives, their spouse, their God. So a lot of this is being kind of looked at by yours truly, and also Aurelius Nobel, who's in the audience today. So basically, what I'm going to show you today are just some various key kind of issues that really matter. And so a huge amount of the paper is just devoted to really nailing down who made wills. Okay, and so that's where a lot of machinery has gone down here. What exists before are simple averages for local towns, local places, maybe perhaps counties. But there's an issue that if we just take simple averages across time, we might miss those counties which just don't report that many, or their archives disappeared, and that is not going to be random across England. So a huge part of the paper does this, and I'm going to give you the executive summary in a moment. Then what I've done is basically looked at that extensive margin of who makes wills, and combined that with an existing sample from a paper from many years ago collected with Greg Clark on of wills from Essex. And this is just a first pass on what the wealth distribution looks like over time from wills, making what I think are sensible kind of calculations. And so the third part is to combine those first two elements. And then I offer to you today, we're going to use these things to look at social mobility over time as well. So, the background to this are some various key empirical studies over the longer run. We've got Guido and Garcia Montero's recent paper in the EHR, which establishes, what was happening over the horizon of the Black Death. I think that this is something that we can actually contribute to once we go further back in time, but today is just going to be for 1500 to 1800. And in that space, we have the work of Peter Lindert, which is this classic paper on equal English wealth in 1670. And what you'll see there is there's a rise in inequality. Maybe it's a bit blurry on the graph right now, but take my word from it. What I'm going to show you, because this isn't a murder mystery, and I'm just going to spoil it now, is a much more violent change in inequality around the time of the Industrial Revolution, driven by a much larger share for the top percentiles and a shrinking of the share of the bottom 90%, which relates to this will-making rate. So what's surprising about this for those of us interested in wealth inequality is that we see just completely different, surprising shifts at various different moments of the wealth distribution. So the idea that we can just observe one part, say the top 1%, and just extrapolate that via some Pareto-based extrapolation to the 99% that we don't observe, I think is completely, quite frankly, rubbished by good empirical evidence. So I think that that's something to kind of think about here, and I'm going to show you evidence which suggests that. This, as I said before, hoovers up a very large collection of big data sets, and so one kind of contribution is just like the total counts of existing wills in England, all of them. Like, so basically the number, right? You know, we haven't got all those wills like sitting on my shelf in London, but we've got these numbers, this graciously shared with me from Brad Clark and also Patrick Wallace and Cliff Webb. And so we'll kind of sharpen this up in kind of related publications, but today we're going to show you like what we've done with this. But also, you know, there's just a nice variety of different sources. We also have like, you know, comprehensive coverage to the present day with wills and probates from earlier work. So the goal here is actually to construct a consistent individual database going back from maybe the early 13th century, maybe 12th century, perhaps. It depends how you interpret those Latin wills at those time, up to the present day, making sensible adjustments. So it's going to be a long-run picture. Okay, so like you're not going. What's the takeaway here? The point is that we've got all these different series, and so what I do is a sensible triangulation of all existing evidence to back out what the national will-making rate is. One of the kind of key natural experiments that we get here is the English Civil War, the interregnum, and during the interregnum, all wills are proved at Canterbury Court. So you get a kind of information there. So I'm able to take that information and use the existing will series where there is no, you know, centralized collection to extrapolate what the likely will-making rate is for, say, Sussex or Nottinghamshire, who actually we don't have any clue about the local will-making rate, but we do see, you know, like evidence centrally from the very elite court of the Prerogative Court of Canterbury. So English will-making is basically dealt with by two courts, the local courts, the local ecclesiastical courts, and the centralised Prerogative Court of Canterbury. And the Prerogative Court of Canterbury is a much more elite collection of wills, basically property that was held in more than two parishes, for example, and you also have Prerogative Court of York. So basically we collected all of this together and kind of backed out what the likely will-making rate is, and there's a bit of, you know, regression-based methods, which I'm just skipping over here. Everything's highly significant, of course, and you're able to predict it and then have a robust, okay, and so basically, you have two different ways of estimating this, one using the interregnum and one using basically the interregnum combined with outside the interregnum. And then basically you can calibrate these two together and, okay, more regressions. So it does go on a bit. This is the takeaway for the major part of this first section. You have an estimated interregnum rate of around 15%. 0.151 of debts leaving some sort of will, right? And then you have a kind of, this aligns with, you know, the interpolated rate from the county court series that the paper attempts to do. So basically you see a rising share of decedents, those people dying who leave wills, and then surprisingly, and this has been noted by, you know, just by Clark and also by anybody who's tried to attempt this before, a declining share. And the decline is real, it stands up to, like, you know, the techniques used in this paper, and you'll notice that it kind of more or less corresponds with the proportion who are probated, who have some sort of significant level of wealth. And this is kind of really key for inferring what percentage of the population is being, sampled by this will selection. Okay, a really kind of nice feature of using individual level data is that you can kind of slice it across many different dimensions. So one of the first things we've done in a paper with Aurelius and Ziming Zhu is look at the gender breakdown of who's making wills. And what's surprising is that you just see this secular trend of female wills from the early 17th century that rises consistently throughout this time. When you look at the will making rate, you can see that it's declining for both men and women, but it's declining less for women than it is for men. So I think that's an important feature. Now, the interpretation is really key. Does this mean that the English population is being immiserated as you go through the process of industrialization? Okay, so this might be, an interpretation that like Engels would see with the data and the urbanization. There's the biological standard of living literature. We know that the wage evidence is kind of ambiguous on this, flat wages. It could also be that the culture of will making is just changing. In a richer society, maybe we just don't care about who gets our cutlery, right? So, I mean, these things, there's no final interpretation, but we're going to assume that there's some information here when we look at these wealth shares. So if you don't like it, that's good information for us to take forward. So the second kind of part of this paper is using an existing sample, which will be replicated with a very nuanced big data textual analysis, algorithmically. AI will be involved in a very big way, believe it or not, and in reading those wills and coding them. But before we kind of had the age of AI, we had the age of an insomniac co-author who liked to regulate his sleeping patterns by reading wills all night and coding them to an Excel spreadsheet, and a more junior co-author who wasn't desperately keen on this but did it. But you'd learn a lot by staring at these things. So Greg and I have an existing work, and there's actually Guido mentioned that it might be an idea to look at inequality within that sample a while back. And so there's we basically summarized what was in these wills in terms of cash bequests, annuities, goods, livestock, and also land, of course, which wills mention after the statute of wills in the early 16th century. And you can look within this, but the key moment is that you can see here within will makers that the top 10% are growing richer, and the bottom 10%, even if they have wills, have next to nothing. And you can see that basically this is just kind of the intensive margin of will makers. But if we combine this information, I'm just going to skip forward here. Apologies. This is kind of another takeaway. This combines that extensive margin, so I've created a synthetic level, individual level database so I can calculate what the top 10% are, adding in a load of people with pretty much a pound a death or something Infer, depending on, the era, and this can be adjusted, of course. And so what you see here is an increasing share at the really top percentiles, the top 10th of 1%. It's quite dramatic, it's quite significant. And you can see that the bottom 90% are shrinking massively. And even within the top 10%, there's a kind of a squeeze. And I think this is really interesting because this is in the direction of what Lindert found, but it just much more dramatic. And also I'll say these shares, which can be visualized, the same data visualized in a different way, when you plot the Gini coefficient or the Thiel coefficient, they move around, but they don't really show how dramatic the movements are. So I think just looking at these different shares kind of tells a kind of a different story. And also, this data is just making the bottom 90% one, so it really makes dramatic what's happening at these wealth shares. But I'll just kind of give this is table comparing it to Linder's. That's not going to work in a presentation like this, so more apologies. I just want to just take a step out from the wills and think about while within the wills, over this period, you're seeing a share of top percentiles. That's a very kind of democratic way of sampling the wealth distribution. Separately, people like Rubinstein, very famous in this area, has collected books on the the richest English over the past 1,000 years. And if you just plot their data and look at what percentage of national income, these gigantic whales, as I'm calling them, that's declining massively over time. So the point is there's different things happening at different moments of the wealth distribution. So wealth inequality is rising over the period of the Industrial Revolution, but over the long run, you know, these people like Alan Rufus or the Earl of Arundel and Warren, Sir John Spencer, have much higher relative wealth than, say, Sir John Ellerman, who was the richest testator in my kind of 20th century probate data. Okay, so that's just like a little snapshot of the wealth inequality stuff. What I want to talk about now is social mobility. So social mobility is, I think, structurally connected to wealth inequality, okay? And we're just beginning to kind of understand how those two dynamics are related. And I'm going to finish with how they're related, and it's quite surprising how they relate to each other. But I think it's important scientifically to estimate these parameters separately and just see how they move together. So what I've done for you here is very similar to the analysis that Guido talked about in the talk, on the opening talk, which was the work on social mobility over the very long run in England, looking at surnames. Guido talked about a figure that Greg and I have of Norman surnames, the Norman conquerors of England and Wales. Basically, if you look at their representation at Oxford and Cambridge universities, that's, you know, your measure of elite status at the surname level. You can see that they're about 30 times overrepresented in the 13th century, and they're about like 50% over-related today. So going from, you know, a factor of 30 to 1.5 over a millennia, right? So what's interesting about that is that, you know, it paints a kind of world of social mobility that's very glacial. And our interpretation is that it's very different measuring transitory movements, say year to year or even generation to generation, than measuring things over multiple generations, centuries, and even millennia. And the reason is measurement error. So what happens in different data sources and also in different eras, that basically there's a different dynamic in terms of how wealth and status is obtained. And so our interpretation is that basically you need to kind of distinguish between these short-run transitory movements. For example, you could have, say, a family move between the top 10% in a given city down to the 90th percentile, but then move back up again in the next generation. And that would be measured as kind of transitory movement, which is important and is real and is describing the reality we have. But the reality is that family is staying more or less at the top, right? And so when you look at surname distributions, or you can use individual level data with different techniques, multiple measures, different strategies now that are being popular in this literature. So what I offer you today is basically a surname analysis of this big will data. And so I've got the complete collection of 1 million prerogative court of Canterbury wills. And inside the data, I just look at who are the really rich families, okay? And get different levels of being super well off. And so what we do is a method called relative representation. So that this will be basically, if you're in this elite database, just as common as we would expect the kind of most common names in England, like Clark, Taylor, Smith, we call that 1. So your representation is exactly what we would expect given your population share. And we're able to, I've got an extensive collection of parish records to get what that number is. And so here we define a set of representation for like these super elites. 20 to 50 is the like just, you know, spectacularly rich families. And they're 10 to 20 is another band, 5 to 10. And I think that's a typo in the paper, more apologies. And so I want to show you this graph. This shows you this dynamic. We defined these in the 16th century, okay? So you can see right at the top, this is relative to 1 is the average. And you can see in that first kind of generation from when they're defined in 1500, there's a very high level of social mobility. But that's because that estimate is composed of a lot of families who are getting this transitory shock, right? So basically you have this kind of random component to mobility that following them over more generations filters out. And why does this matter? They're both correct. Measuring one generation correlations, multiple generation are both correct. But if you want to know who the rich of Italy or England are going to be in 500 years' time, the transitory thing is not what you want. You want the underlying dynamic component that you can only measure with multi-generational data and structured in this way. So when you do this, you kind of filter out that first generation and then you look from 1600 on at what the rate of regression towards the mean is. And that's what it looks like visually. And you can see it bumps around there. These are going to be smaller groups, but it's fairly consistent. And if you just run a regression on that, you get a social mobility coefficient that's just consistent within these different bands of about 0.8. And it's, I think that's just really compelling, but I'd like to point out that conceptually, I think it's very worthwhile, and I think we're only starting to get to this in distinguishing these two elements of mobility. Okay, so we can talk about inequality, but if there's different things happening at different moments of the distribution, as I showed you with the wealth inequality stuff, that matters. But here you could imagine a world in which you could have different transitory components with like just a very stable underlying long run component. So I think, this is basically a call to think about the longer run dynamics of this and to distinguish between short run transitory movements and longer term dynamics, which I think is, Greg and I were kind of exclusively thinking of these longer run dynamics and thinking about the short run transitory moment as being basically measurement error, perhaps. So I lost track of time. Thank you very much for listening. And it's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Grazie Neil per il lungo periodo dell'Inghilterra.
Very much for...
Facciamo una pausa di mezz'ora e non ritorniamo.
We have a half an hour break. We will be back at 4:35. Okay, more or less. Thank you.
Grazie. Conosce il sistema, no? Prendiamo
Hello, good evening. We start the session again with the Q&A session. Well, so questions for the first communication. We take all the questions. For Wouter, Paccoud Antoine.
So, Larry, do you want me to...
Vuoi che io faccia domanda per le due
Do you want the questions first only to Wouter, or shall I put them... We're taking one paper at a time. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for your presentations. For Wouter and Wouter. So what I'm curious about... so I'm not throwing a curveball at anyone. So what I'm very curious about is about the... So I'm worried about the northern part of your story because of property. So these taxes are over immobile property. But Schiedam, I would expect that people own ships before the distilleries. The ships are not in your tax reports, and the wealthiest guys around in these small little ports, like, you know, Horn, Enkhuizen, Medemblik, blah, 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 are ship owners. They don't own houses. If they're not married, they don't even rent them. They rent a room, and they're filthy rich. You don't see these guys. You see them later on in the distilleries, right? But the problem is the distilleries are co-owned by these guys because they are on slave trade. That's why the distilleries are there, right? They're feeding the slave trade. So how to catch these guys? This is one question. And this question is not innocent because there's huge consequences if you extend your cases northwards. Because after the 1720s, 80% of the skippers and captains in Amsterdam, and I know you don't need to do Amsterdam, we don't need to care about Amsterdam, but these men come from Frisia. These are Frisians. They're ship owners. They come with their ships. They live in rooms because they have their families in Frisia where they are small landowners. And what you see very often is that their income on those ships, on the Amsterdam trade, right, is being shipped off to Frisia to actually, almost for conspicuous consumption or buying more land back in Frisia. So you will find increased wealth in those farms or in Taro or whatever they're doing, but you never see these men back in the taxation reports. So this is just, it's not provocative, but have you thought about the problem of these small harbors where the majority of the wealth is in the hands of these skippers translated into ships and not houses?
Grazie per Sonia Schifano e Wouter Ryckbosch.
Hi, is it okay if I pose a question in English? Yeah. Thanks a lot for your excellent and very interesting paper. I'll keep it very brief, especially with your smaller case, so not Luxembourg City. I'm very interested in the fact that you start your situation in 1766, I think, which is a feudal context. And actually, it's very interesting that these feudal rights are also in the cadastre that you use, which is a very valuable and interesting source for that. And then your later sample year, then the feudal system has been abolished. I'm also wondering, therefore, whether in that feudal period there are also still common rights, so usage rights to forests, meadows, marshlands, whatever, because in other areas in Luxembourg, I know they still persisted for a long time until the very end of the 18th century. And of course, these common rights, if they were extensive, were usually, or sometimes, more equitably shared among inhabitants, in some regions at least, which might have played an important role in, producing different levels of actual income distributions, and might affect your interpretation of rising inequality throughout this period. So that's it. Thank you.
Grazie. Per Sonia ancora Gabriel Berea.
Faccio in inglese. So, thanks for the paper. I was just thinking, first, just clarification, because if I got it wrong, there's no need for question. So, it was a rank correlation that you showed us. Okay, nice. So, I'm just curious, because if you think, at least in the contemporary economics, yeah, one of the main interests when relating social mobility to inequality, yeah, is to see if they correlate. Yeah, I suppose you know, I don't know if you remember this correct, the Great Gatsby curve and these kind of things. So when you showed us the inequality measures, the other seat, not the Luxembourg one, had a much higher inequality, yeah? While when you showed us the rank correlations, it was radically the contrary. Can you have some, I don't know, some clarifications or elaborate a little bit more there? Thank you.
Grazie. Non abbiamo 6 questioni.
And now 6 questions. Guido Alfani.
Thank you. I have a question for Nick.
Ho una domanda per Neil Cummins e anche un piccolo commento. La prima domanda, ho capito molto bene che quello che stai facendo...
Which is reasonable, also given the method. But still, I would like to know your opinion about this hypothesis by Bierman and Dean, who argue that the beginning of the civil war in 1642 might have been triggered by declining upward mobility in the preceding decades. And I'm curious whether you have an opinion about that. The comment is about your graph based on Rubinstein data. Of course, the percentage of control of command over the national income in the 12th century and after is a kind of complicated variable, so to say. But more importantly, if I remember correctly, that data set, I think there is a huge sampling issue, so I'm not sure at all that you can actually do that, if not, in a very illustrative way, so to say, right? But I think there is a problem there.
Grazie. Marianne?
It's a question for Neil Cummins. It's a very interesting paper. There's a lot of assumptions in the paper, and I had a hard time following some of them, so I'm going to focus on your sources on wills, which is a source I've done a lot of work with up until only about the mid-16th century, though. First of all, you listed the Husting Court, but you could never use the Husting Court wills. I would just take that out because they only list immovable property in London. So they're missing any property owned outside of London. There's no immovable property, no personal, very few personal or charitable bequests. So they're completely unsuitable and couldn't be used. As you admit, the PCC wills are just at really the top level, and that these kind of local courts, but unfortunately a lot of the local courts have not been as well exploited, and I would be curious, because your table showed the possibles, and I wasn't sure how many of those have been really looked at, but in London, for example, it's going to make a big difference if you look at commissary court wills. Well, commissary court wills, there's a list of them, but there's very little transcriptions. The registers, there's one that's been digitized. You're going to have to go through all of them. They're shorter because they're middling group people. But if you wanted a true picture, in London at least, of social mobility and wealth, you would have to look at this middling group, which was larger than the number of people who ever made PCC wills. And that is going to be the same in other jurisdictions. And as you probably know, some of these places, it's a nightmare what the jurisdictions are. I mean, in London, there's 4 different jurisdictions. So, and then my real question, though, is about the parish records, which you say you look at. That's a lot. I mean, the wills alone, I mean, I've probably coded 1,000 wills in my life. I can't even imagine, even if you stay up all night, the coding that's involved in some of these wills. So I'd love to see, is there a code book? You know, what it is that you're coding? You know, that type of thing, because there's massive numbers of bequests, and they never end in a total wealth. I mean, you presumably have some formula that you used about how wealthy somebody is. A lot of people for London would just use the attribution of the company, for example. That would give you at least a proxy measure. But the parish records, those are even more complex because they could be church wardens' accounts or poor rates. I mean, what exactly are those? And that is a lot of archival reading. There are certainly for the 17th and 18th century more of them in print, but they're hard to quantify. I'd just be curious. I know you're looking mainly for surnames, but that's such a fraught problem tracking these surnames because migration in and out is massive in some of these periods. Thank you.
Grazie. Maria Fusar.
Thank you very much to everyone, actually. I have a question which is actually related to the very long-term projections. Because although in the title of the sort of communication, it was like 1800, you know, I saw that both in the actual paper itself and in some of the graphs, you move up to 2000. What I'm wondering is, how do you plan to compensate or to accommodate the monumental amount of jurisdictional change that, for the period particularly after the 1820s, when there is an acceleration of this, make the wealth of individuals as expressed in their wills not anymore really representative of the real wealth because of a series of legal instrument packages and items. So some notices about what was testable and what was not starts in the 16th century, to my knowledge, in England. But then the acceleration from the 19th century is massive. So, you know, the will of Bill Gates today, just to make a random example, would not be a representative of his wealth. And this, I think, is particularly skewed in the top income individuals. So these big numbers, I think, might work up until the Datini period, if you will, the Ancien Régime, and not work anymore afterwards. Thank you.
Grazie. Katia Antunes.
So thanks, Neil, for a really cool paper. I have a technical question that relates partially to one of Marianne's questions, so perhaps you can add this little bit. So how are you making the differentiation in the coding of the data between probatory inventories and the testaments themselves? The reason why I ask is because every time we try to do that kind of joke for the Low Countries, where the notaries are public and whatnot, it's a nightmare. And the differences between these two documents for the same person would put this same individual in the same date in two totally different percentiles. So the question, how do you solve these? So I'm sure you can solve it technically, but how did you think about it, and did you think about it at all? And how will that distort your data in the end?
My second question is more of canvassing. As Marianne also stated, there's a lot of assumptions. I am not sure I agree with some of them, but I want to let that out. What I would like to understand, in view of the long data term that you have in the paper, not in your presentation here, so what is it that you think that in the end you're going to tell us? I think you all have a gut feeling of what you want to say. I'm not sure what that is, but what I read in the paper is, again, a lot of exceptionalism for Britain, when every time we try to compare stuff to Britain before 1800, Britain doesn't seem to be that exceptional, really. So, some ideas on that, on the canvassing. Thank you.
Grazie. Fillo. Sofil.
Sofil. Grazie, ovviamente questa sessione è molto interessante e grazie anche a Neil. Quindi anch'io voglio un po', diciamo, riflettere su quello che è stato detto. Nelle tue conclusioni hai parlato
long time frame and dating back to the pre-Black Death period. And it may be just something I'm not fully conceiving in this, but I mean, you know, when I think about peasant wills in this period, I can only think of one published peasant will from the pre-Black Death period. You know, we're talking about 85 to 90% of the population. So is it really a case then of looking for relative proxies of wealth in that respect? Because intestacy, for example, throws up in some local courts. Obviously, Guido Montero's work, which you mentioned a moment ago, in terms of, you know, wealth inequality, which is picked up through taxation records. So these kind of proxy sources, the same I would say for some of those elites. You know, that some of the Wales, as you put it, from the 13th and 14th century, are really not showing up in wills as much as they are showing up in inquisitions post-mortem. So in a sense, I just wonder, you know, what that does for the long time series in terms of the comparisons in your aspirations, really, just how we factor those differences into the story. Thank you.
Grazie. Mare Steele.
Mare Steele.
Professor Cummins, you won't object to me speaking in English, I'm sure. In the 19th century, my great-grandfather was from a wealthy family, was written out of his father's will for marrying a circus girl, a gypsy. And that's an example of downward social mobility, I suppose. We've been trying to get back up ever since. Now, a will is a social document, as you suggested at the beginning. They can be quite interesting to read. So quite apart from quantifying the bequests and what people left and what their property was, there's also the intention behind bequests and what people do. If I can mention Shakespeare twice in one day, one of the most famous bequests in English law is that Shakespeare left his wife his second best bed. Now, was this because he wanted to rebut his wife? Books have been written about this. Almost certainly she was entitled to the best bed anyway, being the widow. The second best bed may have had some affection attached to it. So I'm just thinking about the sort of colour you can get, perhaps mentalité from wills. I have looked briefly at Sarah Churchill's will, the Duchess of Marlborough. I think she died in 1727. She had several different attempts at writing it. It goes to pages and pages on vellum. It's an enormous document. And as she tried to control her family during her life, she insisted on trying to do it after death. And she reached out for decades afterwards by the way the bequests were drawn up. It's a very important aspect of it. Of course, Robert Mondreau used to like this sort of analysis of mortality in wills and diaries. And I'm just wondering how much is slightly off base with the topic, but it is storia, you know, history has a story as well, which one likes to have quite apart from the statistics. So I just raised that question. Thank you.
Grazie. La risposta.
Okay, about the question by Katja about do we see the ships and do we know anything about the ships in the Holland towns? The short answer to the question is no. We don't know anything about the ships. But my first response was to your question was, well, where were their properties invested? So how come we don't see them in the sources? You can also ask yourselves, well, who are the residents? Our approach is to look at inequality and mobility within a community. But are these ship owners part of the community? If they're kind of lodgers in these towns, but they invest, their families are in Frisia, somewhere else. So you can ask yourself, well, are they part of the community? And the second point is then, well, what are we measuring? This is something that we perhaps need to be more explicit in our paper. What are we measuring, and what are we not measuring? Our sources are basically are based on immovable property. Ships are movable property, and similarly, there are also other kinds of properties that we don't know anything about. Movable capital. In Holland, there are a lot of people who are investing in movable capital. There's also a dimension of wealth, a dimension of mobility, but we don't have any information about that. So yeah, it's a limitation imposed by the sources. So there's not much, except apart from acknowledging that we don't know anything about that, there's not much we can do about it, I'm afraid.
Okay, grazie. Sonia Schifano.
Okay, thank you for the questions. So to answer the very first one regarding the use of forest in terms of common rights or not, I'm pretty sure, but honestly I need to look better at this. The Département des Forêts was introduced after the French Revolution in Luxembourg, and in 1766 one of the other categories of land that I didn't mention are forests, pastures, and ponds. So I'm pretty sure they were paying out a rent in order to use them. But actually, I need to look better at this, and I can easily check whether those categories were included among, for instance, the property-less, the one that we're declaring zeros, to give you a final answer. Regarding the second question on the correlation between inequality and social mobility, actually something that I didn't mention, and I didn't do in this paper, but I did in another work of mine. In this paper, I calculated the rank position after I selected the sample, so after I created the links between people. In another paper, I used the original rank position of the original distribution of the cadastre. And what I was noticing is that actually the majority of the people that we were able to link are just among the top 50% of the distribution. So this might be one of the explanations why we have this sort of discrepancy between inequality and social mobility, because the inequality estimates we are looking at the full distribution of people, while somehow our results in terms of social mobility are driven by the richest 50%. So it's something that I can do also in this paper, and I didn't do it because the number of matches, the percentages of matches for Luxembourg City was quite small, but it's actually something that I can do and see what happens when I do this. But thanks. So one of the explanations could be simply that we are looking, in terms of social mobility estimates, we are looking just at one part of the distribution. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. So thanks to all the questions. I mean, these are all like serious points. I'd love to elaborate at length on all of them. I don't have, concrete answers, but they're all very well taken. Let me start with Mark's point. So what you're getting here today is the inequality, social mobility side of this project. In fact, one of the slides I skipped is a tabulation of Shakespeare's will. So one of the nice features of will is that they do express an extraordinary amount of sentiment. If you spend time reading these things, you can find just incredible stories. And I think as you go through time, they become more pro forma and less juicy in particular. But that's something that we can look at. And so part of the project is going to be looking at themes such as romantic affection between spouses. There's lots of stuff, both qualitative and quantitative, you can do here. For example, you can just code up the wills to look at how many are mentioning God or Jesus, and how religious these guys are, and also how much they're actually spending on the church in their will, and the poor of the parish. So you get a real and nominal sense of religiosity. So you can track that over time and look across the distribution. And I think the history of romantic love is fascinating because you see changes in language, but you also have daughters and sons. So you can look at the relative affection of towards your wife or your husband as regard your daughter or son, whether you're a man or a woman. It's fascinating. So yeah, no, it's absolutely a kind of it's a holistic project, and we're really dealing with the full text of the wills and kind of trying to distill that. So with that in mind, this is not like a one-shot deal of coding wills for wealth. What we're working on is building on a mapping of the information in the will to an estimate of the wealth of the will, which is actually kind of flexible and can be updated based on different other sources that are available at certain moments of time. So a lot of these questions, like Philip, Katja, Maria, Marianne, not so much Guido's question, but like a lot of it is about being contextually specific about what a will in a given period of time means. And if we've got secondary information, we can adjust this. So it's very much kind of building up or elaborating upon what Greg and I did manually. And what we're going to be doing here is basically doing it algorithmically, but like with a kind of set of reproducible code that can be tweaked. And the entire kind of goal is to do something as simple as possible, right? So this isn't going to be a black box thing. It's something that we can respond to specific critiques. You've got to bear in mind, and the assumption point, I disagree with some of the assumptions in this paper myself, but the idea was just to get something up and running, like an imperfect statue that we can chip away at, right? And make it better. Modern wealth studies make horrifically, word of the day, violent assumptions about the omitted population, which is typically the vast majority of the population. So we can torture ourselves for not getting it perfectly right, but I mean, we don't get it right today. So, estimates of hidden wealth from myself and others it's huge, and it varies across the distribution. But I think with like individual level data of the kind we're constructing here, it's not a one-shot deal. We can go back and make these assumptions. So that's what, to Philip's question, I would just say, we're going to be kind of adapting this towards the best information. And, we're catching on the probate inventories. I think Peter Lindert's paper was based on probate inventories, which is a much smaller proportion of the population than the wills. So where we have both, that can be cross-referenced, and we envisage doing that. For Maria, the long-term jurisdictional changes, I think that's exactly right. That's where the mapping is going to be time-specific. So the tortured treatment of the probate rate, when I know people who would tell me, why don't you take a simple average and be done with it, was actually a proof of concept of how you could have a time-varying method that just simply models this based on the best available information at the time to kind of get what we think is the most reasonable assumption of the underlying wealth distribution. But of course, even if we kind of infer it, we have this issue of, wealth being hidden or just falling under different jurisdictions, and we'll just try our best to account for it, I guess. In relation to the parish records, I've been collecting lots of major big databases for a long time. The parish records I referenced were just simple birth, marriage, and death records, and they were just to provide a surname distribution for, say, the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and they were digitized by the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. So, you know, I didn't go out and do that. There might be other documents, but they were the parish records. The hustings didn't make the final version of the paper, so in the data that's an oversight on my part. But I will say that the hustings are very imperfect, and I take the point, and you know, there's aspects which there's absolutely new information for me, particularly related to the various jurisdictional information. But the idea would be, if we've got nothing, could we think of a model empirically where we have, you know, say an overlap of, say, hustings with other information? Could we say what the hustings tell us in the eras where we have no other information, with the assumption that the relationship is the same, or there's some sort of maybe accounting for a pre and post trend? And that's imperfect, but you know, I guess the idea is advancing this scientifically. Even if you put something up there and has a wide confidence interval, at least, you know, we can kind of interpret it. And I think, like, a lot of the results, I think, even though they are provisional, were kind of surprising to me. And so finally, very much accept, this is Guido's point with Philip's point, that the Rubinstein data, we could maybe just remove that, perhaps. But you know, it's kind of like a triangulation of things, and it could be, like I was saying to Philip during the break, we could actually just look and see, you know, is our will data, the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, for example, and picking up those people we'd expect it to pick up, for example. Guido gives me a working hypothesis on the theory that the Civil War might have been related to some declining mobility. That's something that we could empirically test. I will say that the way I've structured it so far can't test that, because I've structured it to just look at the kind of post 1600 period. But I think you could use this data to test that hypothesis. So I very much thank you for that suggestion. Indeed. And so, like, I'm going to take this opportunity to finish by stating that during my talk, I promised to talk a little bit about what connects wealth distributions to social mobility over time, and I forgot to, so I again apologize. But surprisingly, it's the marriage market. That's what we're proposing in a bunch of related works. In England and in many other societies, marriage and marriage partners, particularly legitimate marriage, you know, to produce legitimate offspring, is really driving a lot of what's happening in terms of intergenerational mobility. It's a remarkably exciting aspect, because we know from other work that, say, things like the European marriage pattern are pointed to and, you know, debated as being sources of the rise of the West and so forth. But to think of it as being also determining these worlds that we're talking about today is just something I'll finish on. But once again, thank you very much.
Grazie a tutti per l'attenzione di questo.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us in the afternoon session. Please remember, we will be back tomorrow at 9. And we will be back here tomorrow at 9. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.